Hi everyone, I'm Damián Allegretti, Chinese medicine practitioner based in London, and today I'm honored to be speaking with Jonathan Chang, highly respected practitioner from Beijing. Jonathan has a remarkable journey in Chinese medicine, including his time as an assistant to the renowned Dr. Wang Ju Yi, and I'm looking forward to discussing his practice style and approach, the key lessons learned during those years with Dr. Wang, and what it means to carry on his legacy. So it's a privilege to share this conversation with you, John. Thank you so much for being here. And
Okay, thanks, Damián. Thanks for the introduction. Sorry for interrupting.
My pleasure. So this is the first two questions are about a little bit of the introduction for you in Chinese medicine and acupuncture. So the first one is, what initially drew you to the field of traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture?
Yeah, I guess it's a kind of a, I don't know if it's a long story, but when I was in Canada at the time, like, because I grew up in Canada, I was born and raised there. For a long period of time, my dream was to become a Western medical doctor. So like my dad's a doctor, my grandmother's a Western medical doctor too. So I think that was like, I don't know if it was like in our family tradition, but like I knew medicine was a career and it was something that always interested me. And it was something that I think for me at the time when I was in Canada, that my hope was to just, you study medicine in order to be able to help people, to just like relieve some suffering. I think that was my main goal. But then I think, while I was in Canada and going through the education system there, that over time I just got tired of school. I was just like, oh, I'm too much studying. I was kind of exhausted. So then like after I finished my undergraduate student studies in Canada, so like there's a period of time like that final year of university where it's like, what do I do next, right? So part of me wanted a break from school, so I was like, oh, I always wanted for like a long time from throughout all my high school years, I always wanted to go to China just to get back to my roots, to learn about Chinese culture. And because there's something about when you grow up in Canada as like an overseas Chinese, right? You're born there to immigrant parents, that like you kind of lose that connection to your home country. And I didn't know anything about Chinese culture, or not much at all. And there's always felt like there's that part of me that was missing. So, my grandfather tell us a lot of stories about old China and like old Shanghai and things like that. So I always had this curiosity about China. So I thought like, okay, if I ever do go to Western medical school, then it'd be nice to have a period of time in my life where I did try, to learn Chinese and like visit the home ancestral land. So that's what I did. So after university, I came to China. And then it was during that period of time that like I really enjoyed my time in China. I still do, but like at that time, everything is new and unique and different and exciting. And then all I remember is like I first went to Nanjing, and then while I was there, I was teaching English. I was started studying Chinese too. But I remember there were a lot of expats in Nanjing. I remember once we met some Australians who were studying at the Nanjing Chinese Medical University. And at that time, like I think they were just there for like a brief internship or something. But I remember just like the back of my mind, just thinking, oh, like you can study Chinese medicine in China. Like that was never a thing. I never knew that was a thing that was possible. So this is like over 20 years ago. So then, the longer I spent time in China, like there's always a feel like a desire to just get better and learn more about Chinese culture. I think that's why I always kind of persisted. So like I came to Beijing, and then while I was in Beijing, like then I started to think that, okay, because a lot of, there are a lot of expats when they come to China, they might spend a year here, 2 years, or a few years. But I knew a lot of people, when they did go home, they kind of lose everything that they did learn. They lose the language, understand the language, all that stuff. So then when I was in Beijing, there's a part of me, there's a transition period. It's like, okay, now it's time possibly to return to Canada. And if I returned to Canada, I wanted to go back with something tangible. Like I was afraid that I would like go back and forget my Chinese, right? So that was like, what if I studied like, something pragmatic, practical, like possibly Chinese medicine, like that was always in the back of my head. So I was like, maybe that's a potential career. But at that time, my goal was like, I could potentially study Chinese medicine and then go back to Canada and then study Western medicine too afterwards. So that there's always like that, still that idea of like maybe eventually doing Western medicine. So at that time, I was like, okay, like, so I did some research on Chinese medicine because I thought like it'd be the perfect way to one, learn a very pragmatic thing. You can help people or help yourself, you know, because if you have illnesses, treat yourself. But at the same time, I could get a deeper understanding of Chinese culture. So so that's kind of like so that's where I just started doing a lot of research on it. And then it was during that time I met this a friend of a friend was studying with Dr. Wang Ju Yi, so my teacher, who later became my teacher. And she was like, oh, you should first meet my teacher and maybe get some treatments with him and then see what it's like. And so that's what I did. Like I went to his clinic. I'd go there like a couple times a week or maybe a few times a week. I don't remember, but I would go quite frequently just to get treatments. And then afterwards, he would lecture to his students. He had a few American students, so he would lecture to them. And there's this acupuncturist from the States. Her name is Sandra. And she would be translating for them. So I would be listening to the lectures afterward. My treatments, I just sit there and listen. So that made me, I was like, oh, sounds really interesting. And then all I remember is I asked Dr. Wang once, like, can I study Chinese medicine? Is that possible? And then he said, yeah, just go to like the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine and so on and so forth. So that's pretty much started the whole transition into medicine.
Great.
It's a long background.
Yeah, we'll go into more detail
yeah.
during the questions, but yes, great. And can you share like a pivotal moment or experience that solidify your passion for acupuncture? Something you remember specifically?
So I think like for Chinese medicine, like I think I was always, I don't know, I think most people study Chinese medicine if they're from a Western background. That's very difficult to understand, right? A lot of the principles, a lot of the concepts that we learn, like the 5 zong theories, like the 5-phase theories, even channel theory, all these things they seem very abstract, and it's different from because when I was in university, I did a lot of classes, studies on like, biology, biochemistry, organic chemistry, things like that. And so, we think about things at this kind of, microcellular level, just very small, that kind of way of thinking, right? Like, how does this chemical reaction cause that chemical reaction, lead to this, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So this way of seeing the body in this different perspective, right? Like a more, I guess you could say, a holistic approach, like that was very new to me, right? It's just from a completely different way of seeing the body, interpreting like how the body works and our body's interaction with the external environment and so on and so forth. So like, so I remember it was very difficult for me during my studies to really understand Chinese medicine. But fortunately, while I was in school, I had also started studying with Dr. Wang, right? I started apprenticing with him in my second year of university. So I remember like, it was very useful to just observe him apply a lot of these principles we're learning in school in like a clinical practice, and then seeing how those theories were actually used in a clinical setting, and they're very, you realize that's very pragmatic and very useful, it makes sense when you see it being used clinically. So I remember there was like, at the time when I was studying with Dr. Wang, he at first had a lot of patients with like very chronic disorders. And I remember they're becoming for more long-term treatments. Well, all the members, there was one case that came in. This guy, he had this patient, he had ear blockage. I think I told you guys about this story in one of the
Yeah, probably. Yes. But it's always great that you illustrate things going back to cases, because that's the usefulness of this medicine.
So I remember he had the patient had an ear blockage, and so he was on an airplane, and then he had a fever. He's on the airplane, the ear got blocked. And then for 3 weeks, he had this ear blockage with pain in the ear, pain in the eye. And he went to an ENT, and the ear, nose, throat specialist said, oh, you should get there's inflammation of the middle ear, and then you should get surgery, like a minor surgery just to unblock it. And he refused to do that. So he went to see Dr. Wang. So this was, I remember in my mind, I was like, oh, that seems pretty complex. And he's like, I didn't like, I was like, because I was still in my second year of study, second or third years of study. So I was like, oh, it sounds interesting. So I remember Dr. Wang just did, he palpated the channels, and they found a very clear change on the patient's hentaiang channel, small intestine channel. And there's like a little stick there, and then all he did was just bleeding on the patient's jīng point, on the hentaiang channel, just press out maybe 5 to 6 drops of blood just on the tip of the finger there, and then just needled small intestine 6, and that's it. The patient just lay down the bed for treatment table for 20 minutes, and then he got up 20 minutes later. He's like, oh, like my ear is unblocked. It was perfectly fine afterwards. Just one treatment. So I remember like seeing that, because like I was like, oh my God, that was so quick, right? Those results were so fast. So, and for me, unexpected, right? Maybe Dr. Ryan, he probably throughout his career, he probably seen like that. So for him, it wasn't anything new. But he was excited too. He was like, oh, cool. But I remember I was like, wow, that's amazing. I didn't know acupuncture fast. And that was one thing that was like made me like feel like I really wanted to learn this well, like
right.
Yeah, so that was one of the main things that really made me fascinated about acupuncture.
Nice. Okay. So we move to the next section. So in your view, what is the most challenging aspect of being a Chinese medicine practitioner today, both like globally and in China?
Okay, so I can only, because most of my experience as a Chinese medical doctor or practitioner has been in China, right? So let's not speak about from that perspective. My experiences internationally have mainly just been through teaching, right? And then just talking to the local practitioners, like the practitioners who are attending the courses I've been teaching. So it just seems like globally, it seems like each country has its own challenges, right? The practitioners have different challenges they have to face.
It is true.
Usually like different regulations or this and that. So so I think I can't speak for that, because I think each country seems to have its own unique challenges that practitioners face. I think in general, for students, I think the most important difficult challenge is to like learning, like one is getting a good foundational training. Secondly is like after you finish your foundational training is to do continuing education, right? Like what are you going to learn next? Like how are you going to improve your skills? I think the difficulty with Chinese medicine as a whole is that there's just so many different schools of thought, and there's so much to learn that for students, younger, newer practitioners, it's like sometimes you can be overwhelmed with the amount of methods that you can study, right? So there are different ways to learn this medicine, and one way is just to learn everything. But if you have the brain capacity to do that, then yes, do that. But I think from my perspective, my experience, it's better to just find one method that you really are interested in and just try to master it, right? And then if you can master that one thing really well, that's better than studying 100 different things and then just using bits and pieces from each of the different.
I remember talking to you about this like years ago, and you say the same thing, and I always remember that, like going deeper on just one style, one approach, one understanding.
That's what I find is like the difficulty of Chinese medicine, because like when you're first studying it, there's so much out there, right? You're just like, and you want to learn everything, right? Because everything seems interesting. What does that mean? You want to do everything, but then I think I learned, because I did Tai Chi, right? Like I stayed with a Tai Chi teacher before, or like I still do, but I think I learned a lot from him, and just the idea of just really focusing, right? And like really trying to master something. And so that's why I had to really kind of hold back. And I remember being sometimes a bit envious of some of my classmates who they went to like Wudang Shen and they did some Qigong retreat.
Yes.
I wish I could do that, or like, just things like that. But that's one thing I think is that there's a lot to learn. Other challenges, I would say just for more pragmatic issues. I think challenges for maybe people outside of China is just opening your own clinic, right? Like if you don't have, like most of us go into it with the idea like, I'm really curious about Chinese medicine. I want to help myself and help people. I really like this kind of different way of seeing the body. But then the idea is that the pragmatic aspect is like, now you have to start your own clinic, right? Run a business. I think that would be challenging. And that's something that terrifies me. That's one reason why I'm afraid of going back to, Canada and having to open my own clinic. Like, I think I would fail. So,
it can be
like just, and I think it takes up a lot of your energy, right? Like most people go into the medicine because they want to help people, right? They want to use this medicine they learn and help people. But then I think a lot of your energy is then put on like how do you run the business and all that stuff.
Yes. Advertising and all that.
Yeah, I think it could be. In China, I think the challenges, China, like the benefits of Chinese medicine in China is that it is part of the, mainstream medical system, in that, like, it is, if you work in certain public hospitals or community clinics, then it is covered by the public healthcare, right? So you can have a lot of patients. So if I work at a private clinic where a lot of people are paying out of pocket, or they have, private insurance, which can cover the costs. I think with China too, it's the same, like, challenges, I would say, for the medicines, that there is, on the one hand, you will meet people really into Chinese medicine, who love Chinese medicine. That's the only thing they want to do. And those are great patients to have. And then but sometimes you encounter issues where, like, we have these people who are really into Chinese medicine, and then they just jump around to because there's so many practitioners in China, right? So they jump around from one practitioner to the next, one practitioner to the next, or like they go from one province to the next. They search for all these different doctors, right? And that's where I find it's like they also have too much information too. It's like, that doctor said that. So that's where those are the challenging cases, when you have people who encounter patients who know a bit.
Yes,
and then you aren't like really.
They can be more demanding somehow.
Yeah. But it's also a sign of a pathology too. So I think it's kind of interesting to meet these kinds of patients. Challenges, I think are there any other challenges? I don't know. I think, I don't see too much. I think it's just like when you're starting out, I think that's probably the most challenging thing, is when you are, how to start your practice and how to start to, get more patients. I think those are probably the things that kind of worry people the most when they first start doing things. But I think for me, it's mostly like the experience of being a Chinese medical practitioner. We just talked about the medicine itself, is that it's always very rewarding experience, right? Like you're always gaining a lot each day from, each patient you treat. And I think it's just, for each patient you treat, it just deepens your understanding, right? And I think that's really rewarding, right? And then you have challenging cases. I think that's where it can be, where like you don't get it right, and then you figure it out, right? Or you try to figure it out, you never figure it out, but at least it'll make you think and improve your approach.
Well, that was actually the next question. What is the rewarding aspect, and what keeps you inspired? Probably it's just that, the thinking process, but also at the same time helping the people, seeing the people getting better.
I think so. Like as I mentioned earlier, when I first went to medicine, or Chinese medicine, was that I wanted to help people, right? That was the main goal, is like just to alleviate people's sufferings, right? That's the main goal. But then I remember when I was with Dr. Wang, he would say the same thing. Like that was probably his initial reason for becoming a doctor, right? Like he wanted to figure out ways to help people in like the most optimal way, right? And like with the most like achieving like the best, or coming to the best approach to alleviating a person's condition, or thing that was giving them the most discomfort. But then what I realized when I was studying with Dr. Wang, you could see what he really loved was that thought process, right? Like when a patient comes in and trying to figure out the illness, right? Kind of like Sherlock Holmes. He always like to give those examples of being like a detective, right? And the patient comes in, needs symptoms, and you have to figure out, like you're trying to find the culprit, like what is causing this patient this disorder, right? And then you can see he really loved that process of thinking about it, figuring it out, and then coming to a hypothesis, right? And then testing it out. I think, and that's what I found about the more I practice, is that's what I love too. It's just like the patient comes in, you have no idea the patient's gonna come in for, right? And then you have to immediately, within a certain amount of time, you have to figure it out, right? And then you really hope that within maybe the treatment, or after the treatment, or within 3 treatments, the patient will show some kind of improvement, right? So I think I like that challenge. I like that instantaneous like way your brain has to work like really intensely to figure things out. So I find that it's like working on a puzzle, right? Like that's what I find that's exciting about Chinese medicine. And then when you get it right, it's almost like you have this really experience, right? Like it's like I think most practitioners have that experience. Like when they get it right and you get amazing results, or something happens, your brain is like
Oh
so
yeah.
happy, right?
Yes.
It's
So
like,
yes, so happy. It makes your day. Yes.
yeah. And then when it doesn't work, then you're just like, oh, and then you're like, your brain thinks, oh, I could have done this. But that's also a fun process to go through, because then the next time, maybe the patient comes again, then you're able to figure it out. Or if they don't come again, maybe another patient with a similar issue comes. And by that time, you have a better idea of like
Exactly.
what to do. I just like the idea of how you're constantly improving, right? Like improving your understanding of the medicine, and that kind of stimulation, I think, is something that it's almost irreplaceable. I don't know where else you would be able to get that kind of stimulation, but I
Yeah.
really love it.
Yes, yes, yes. Agree 100%. Great. Okay, and to finish this section, how do you prioritize self-care and maintain your own well-being while caring for others? This is something
Yeah,
I wonder myself as well. So,
yeah, this
the
is something that I wonder about too. So, like, I studied with a teacher who put his entire life into Chinese medicine, right? Like, he did like everything was about Chinese medicine. Like, he
Mhm.
would read books until like the following morning, right? He wouldn't go to sleep just because he wanted to study Chinese medicine. And so my Dr. Wang probably didn't have because he loved Chinese medicine so much, he didn't use the most appropriate methods of health cultivation, right? So like, but one thing I did learn from him was that when you are practicing, right, when you're actually treating patients, it's very important to be very grounded and centered. So, because a lot of people would ask him, like, do you do Qigong, right? Do you do any kind of Qigong practice? But he said, no, like his method of Qigong was just doing acupuncture, right? So when you're needling a patient, or even when I saw him when he was with the patient asking questions, he always seemed very grounded, right? He never seemed like he was very like, yes, she was very centered, grounded and very calm. Even though the clinic around him could be very busy, there's all this hustle and bustle going around him, he was always working at his own pace. But he was like efficient though, like he would like a good, like very efficient use of his time, but he was working at his own pace. So
But
that's what I've realized.
internally, yes.
Yeah. So finding that internal like pace so that you don't like go too fast when you're with the patients, because sometimes you can make mistakes, right? You just slightly lose that focus. So one thing I did realize is just trying to like slow things down internally when you're really busy, right? You have all these things going on, but you have to really kind of center yourself, ground yourself. And that's one thing I've realized when I get a bit busier in my clinic sometimes. Those times I just like I try to imagine what Doc Ron did, and I realized, oh, that's why he walked slowly. That's why he everything he did, his move, like certain things he did were just a bit slower. Because like when things, if you go along with that pace around you, then you just end up making mistakes, right? So you have to really make sure you breath, calm down, and just it keeps you more focused. So in terms of like balancing yourself, like because I did study Tai Chi, like Chen style Tai Chi before I studied Chinese medicine. So I find like doing the breathing techniques, the Tai Chi, they call it the tuna gong, like the breathing technique. I think that is very useful, just helping to keep me calm, rested. I think you're right. There are issues that, like practicing Tai Chi when I have the time. But I find it difficult, right? Like I think most people when they have families, they encounter this, right? You have like your family life, your work life, and then trying to find that balance. I find it's very challenging. And it's something I think we all have to find methods on.
Yes.
One method is just drink tons of coffee to keep you energy. And then but when you have kids, like sometimes the only time I have to work is late at night, and then that's terrible, right? So, and then just have to drinking tons of coffee. That's not a long-term solution, right? So, I think ideally is that you go to bed early. I find sleep is important, right? Like if I have a busy day the next day, I try to go to bed earlier just so that during the day I'll have more energy, right? And just try to pace yourself as appropriately as possible. But I find like I was saying, during the clinic, when things get busy, just try to slow your internal like engine down a bit.
That's a really good advice, actually. It's easy to rush when you have a busy day, and then, as you said, the thinking process is not that clear. So it's easy to also make mistakes or just have like a sloppy thinking, which.
Yeah. because you don't want to have that like that little instance where you miss that like instance where maybe you shouldn't have needled in that way and you just were like, oh, you got a bit lazy, and then like little things like that, right? So yeah, that's one thing I learned from Dr. Wang, just observing how Dr. Wang would work, just it would be a bit slower when things get busy.
Excellent. Okay, so now we move to the next section, which is more or less about Dr. Wang, a little bit more.
Okay.
So you study herbal medicine in school, but you focus on acupuncture under Dr. Wang Ju Yi guidance. So can you share a little bit how this mentorship began? Well, you said a little bit before, but maybe you can go into some other details.
So I was Dr. Wang's patient before I became a student, and when I did express interest in studying Chinese medicine, he told me after I finished my first years of study, like getting the foundational classes down, then I could start interning with him afterwards, like apprenticing him after. He just said study. So I was like, okay, sure. I'm pretty like, I didn't know anything about Chinese medicine. I was like, okay, sure, I'll do that. And then in the back of my mind, because I didn't know much about Dr. Wang or about his met technique or how unique he was compared to other doctors, right? So I just knew about him because during that time I had met Dr. Wang's other students like, Nisa Tang or, Jason Robertson or Yafim, people like that. So they had all said, oh, study with Dr. Wang, Dr. Wang. And so then I was like, okay, sure, like I'll do that. And so after my first year of studies, I just, I went to start studying with him in the August of 2008. So I remember it was around the time of the Beijing Olympics. So that's when I started studying with him. And basically it was just like a clinical internship. So he would work a few times per week, a few mornings per week, I think at the time. So we just I would go in the mornings, he would have patients, like in between patients, he would sometimes lecture or talk about the cases. But, because in my second year, I didn't know anything about Chinese medicine. I was just like, so I just sit there and just observe. And then there's a more senior student there at the time, Shelley Oakes was there. So she was really into like the history of medicine, Chinese medicine. So her and Dr. Wang would always have these discussions about the history and different philosophies from a long time ago. But that was like kind of a bit over my head. But for me, like I think the traditional Chinese apprentice approach is a lot of its observation. So you just have to like sit, you just observe, and you just somehow you absorb a lot of things just by watching, and then just that's what happened for a long period of time. And then Dr. Wang, during that period of time, he would also start having students coming overseas to study with them. I think it's due to the publication of Jason's book, right? The Applied Channel Theory in Chinese Medicine. So a lot of people would start going to Beijing to study with them. So during that time, Dr. Wang would lecture when those students were there, and then so I learned a lot through that. It was like a combination of like systematic lectures, but also like clinical observation of clinical practice or like discussions of cases. And then, as the more I studied with them, then we started, when there were more students, we started to practice more like the palpation and like location, like palpation channels, palpation points. And there's just kind of this very gradual period because I spent 9 years with Dr. Wang, right? So it became like just slowly once I became a little bit understanding of what he was about the system, the applied channel theory medical system, that then like I started to assist more, right? So like when the students were there, I'd help to assist with like teaching them a bit of the palpation, the point locations, and then it became where like I would start like for a while. I think after I graduated, during that period of time, that's when I started to become Dr. Wang's full-time assistant. So like when students came, I'd be translating. So I'd be translating all of Dr. Wang's lectures while they're there, or the entire time. Like I'd be translating all the time. And then in the afternoons, I started doing like tutorials for the students. So then it became like a teaching thing. So I think that constant, like one is clinical observation, translating, teaching students. And then that was how I really deepened my understanding of this entire practice. Another thing that was really cool is that from 2012 to 2014, Dr. Wang, for a while, he always had his private clinic. That's where we were always there. And then for a period of time from 2012 to 2014, he was working at the Hugusi Chinese Medical Hospital. And he was there every Wednesday morning. So for me, this was a great experience because in the mornings, there were 4 students there, 3 Chinese students and myself. And then he would give us each student 2 to 3 or 4 patients. And we would do the intake, including pulse and tongue diagnosis, but then also palpate the channels. And we would write down the cases, and then we would give them to Dr. Wang. He would review them, and then he would come up with the diagnosis, and then treat the patients. And some patients we would needle too. But that period of time was very useful for me to understand really how to improve my palpation skills and figure things out. Because then his private clinic, it was harder to do that. Like we would observe a lot, and maybe some patients we'd be able to palpate some of the changes and things like that. But it's different, right? It's a different kind of, because some of those patients, they just wanted to have that experience with Dr. Wang, right? They didn't want a student intake and something like that. But the public hospital was fine. Like we're just palpating these channels and figuring out the case. So I learned a lot during that period of time.
Wow.
So another thing was I did have on the side, I also would sometimes have my own patients, and then that was useful too, to treat some patients on the side and like be able to discuss some of the cases with Dr. Wang. But overall, the internship was a lot of observation, a lot of like translating his lectures, which I thought was really good at figuring out, deepening my understanding of Dr. Wang's teaching. Because I remember, because I translated so much that by the end, like the last few years, like I already knew what he was going to talk about because I translated so much. So I'd be like, oh, like I knew what he would say, or because he, So I thought that was really very useful, and then just that constant practice, right, of like practicing palpation points and practicing, the location of the channels. And if we weren't palpating accurately, we just, ask Dr. Wang. He'd just sit it over there. We'd be like, Dr. Wang, he'd show us. And so I think that was it's just like the slow kind of absorption of this material, right, over like a 9-year period, right, and that we would write articles sometimes, we do other things like that. And so there's a lot of different ways we learn this, right? So it's just like, for me, it was like very, 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 it was like everything I learned about Chinese medicine was from Dr. Wang.
Amazing. Great. And you answered the following question, so that's good.
Okay, good. What was the following question? What did I learn from Dr. Wang?
Yeah, exactly. What did those years teach you? But this one is really interesting to me. So what were some of the most significant lessons or principles? So talking probably something about more specific. I mean, you said something already, but anything you want to add probably to that?
I think we'll start from like a lot of things. I think I learned so much from Dr. Wang, right? So like one was like just observing how he worked in the clinic, just how do you communicate with the patients. I think I naturally like kind of absorbed like his way of communicating with patients, like the present, and like they're just little things, things he would say. And then one is that. Another is just like what I was saying earlier, just like how when you're just to be grounded, try to be as grounded as possible. Secondly is to how conscientious you should be with each patient, or like really take your time when I just remember so many cases where you just really carefully be palpating for the location of the point, or really trying to examine like the exact location where the pain was and trying to feel what the change was, or like his location, like the dew vessel, like really trying to accurately locate like each vertebrae and finding that this is actually like, the 7th vertebrae or whatever, or like T7 or something, like really just all these like very little precise things he would do to make sure he is very accurate, right? Like he was locating the points in the right space. So I think that was very important. Secondly, just overall how do you become a good doctor, right? So like the fact that he was always reading about Chinese medicine, thinking about it, and practicing it, always being curious about the medicine. I think that was one thing. Secondly, is just like the overall the system that he developed, right? The applied channel theory system, right? What we call經絡醫學, right? So you could call it like a channel-based medicine if we do a more direct translation of his system. But just that entire system incorporates like from channel theory. So this understanding of like the channel qi transformation, the physiology of the channels, to really understand and interpret how the channels work. And then also integrating that with like doing this kind of examination of the channels, right? The diagnosis of the channels. So this kind of physical palpation of the channels, and then integrating those two pieces of information and then going on to the treatment, like, so which points we select, how do we select them, what the point pairs. So I think it's just like this a complete system, like mastery of that system,
Yes.
and trying to master that system. It takes time, right? And just like what I learned from is like really trying to stick to those principles, right? Like we have, you know, just for each patient, just try to stick to the same principles. Don't try to do too much, right? Because sometimes we can overthink and we try to do too much, right? And trying not to do that. That's one thing I learned. But really trying to stick to your process, right? Like I'm a practitioner of applied channel theory, then I'll stick to these principles for each patient. Because sometimes like it's easy to do more and more and more and more. That's out of your framework, and it can lead to just a very unclear diagnosis and not necessarily great results. And then really trusting the process and testing it out. I think that's what I learned from.
Right.
And I think just other things like his general personality is to trying to be modest and humble and with the patients. You know, like I mentioned before that he'd always mentioned that his life's goal was never to become a famous doctor, right? Fame did never interested him. His goal was to become because in Chinese the saying of famous doctor is called ming yi. Be famous, right? But then there's another terminology called, also sounds the same, called ming, also pronounced ming yi. But that ming is the same ming we use for like the yang ming, right? Like to be clear, right? So to be a doctor with like a clear understanding of the medicine. So that's why I think I try to remind myself, like if you have that goal, then it'll just really push you towards trying to find a system that really can help you develop that kind of clear understanding of for each treatment, or I would develop a better understanding of this medicine, right? So I think for me, like his Dr. Wang system has helped contribute to that a lot. So like, because it's a very systematic, very comprehensive approach to treatment.
That's really nice. And all the stuff you mentioned is the stuff you can learn just by observation, and it's not in the books. None of that is in the books.
Right.
I always think about that. We have the points, we have this, we have that, but the stuff you learn from observing a master, you know, it's really not in the books.
Right. I think there's something what I always remember was going to his clinic and seeing the clinic itself as this very organic place too, right? It's always in motion. There's always, things are always going on. And that like, it's an organism in itself, like just like the life of the clinic, right? Like you go there and just, and so Matt see like Doctor and say, I'm walking in and say, hey, good morning. Or like he'd be there first and I'd show me like, ciao. And then the patients would come in, the students would start coming in, and then, you know, the day would start, you know, and it's always going. And then, you know, you can imagine yourself if I wasn't there, you know, I had to go back home, but then for like a couple of weeks for holidays or something. And then like the clinic would continue going, right? It's just a constant motion and moving.
Yes.
And there's so much to it, right? And so much going on. And every day, you know, something different happens. And yeah, so you'll see things that that are not mentioned in the books, right? Like, and or you see how diverse this medicine is. Like for example, we talk about one point, right? You can say, oh, this point does this, but then you can see how doctor will use that point in different circumstances, right? Which is hard to see in a written page.
Exactly. Nice. Okay, so just a few more questions, more related probably to the legacy or the understanding of Dr. Wang. So the first one is, how did Dr. Wang's teaching shape your understanding of diagnosis in Chinese medicine and in acupuncture?
Okay, so traditionally when we were in school, we learned about the basics, right? The 4 methods of diagnosis, like observation, like the intake, the inquiry, pulse diagnosis, and tongue diagnosis. So what I found that with Dr. Wang was one thing that he was really good at was asking the right questions, like trying to get the right answers from the patients. I'm still not as good at that, but he would ask very direct questions and trying to get the right pieces of information. And then through that, developing that very clear kind of symptom pattern, right? So like for him, as he called like the constructing the symptom pattern, right? Or the symptom pattern structure. So I think that's one thing I realized more and more the importance of. But that takes time, right? That takes, for me, I think that just takes a lot of experience and time, and, you know, reading a lot of books about, you know, symptom patterns, like including like the Shahanwen or so on and so forth. And then secondly is just like linking that or connecting that information with the findings from what we do through the channel examination, right? So they're like usually we do the palpation of the distal channels, and through that usually pushes you into a clearer diagnosis, right? Because we try to make connections between what we're finding in the channels with the patient's symptoms, right? And that usually that will lead you to decide which channel or channels should be treated first, right? To treat the patient's main complaint. So those are things I've for Dr. Wang's approach is essential, right? So like Dr. Wang always hoped that like people who get really into applied channel theory is that they are just, once they start using channel examination, it's like for every patient, they have to use it, right? So if you don't examine the channels, you just don't feel confident in your diagnosis, right? So, and this is mentioned in the classics too, right? Like back in the Beijing, they mentioned that, you know, like for all acupuncturists, before you proceed with the treatment, you have to first examine the channels, right? So that's something that it's not like just from Dr. Wang, it's like mentioned like thousands of years ago, right? By our ancient, you know, forefathers of Chinese medicine, they all said that too. So I think that's one thing, is just like the idea of this art of, you know, palpation, physical palpation of the body with a focus on the channels. That's something that's been lost over the years, just because of, most likely because of, you know, Chinese society became more and more conservative, and they forbid you from touching your patients. So with Dr. Wang's approach is kind of recovering this this method of, you know, examination of the channels, right, from physical palpation of the body. So I think that's essential for helping to achieve a clear diagnosis. But then you also have to have a good understanding of like the channel physiology, right, the channel qi transformation. So how does each channel work, and what are their unique functions in regulating the body? So once you have master of these two aspects, then I think your diagnosis is much clearer. Because what I find that with the ideas of the channel physiology, it really helps to compartmentalize or categorize each organ system or organ channel system, so that you just have a better understanding of how these different organs work together, interact with one another, right, to carry out different physiological functions. Whereas when school, I think it seems like it's more separate. It's like the heart is this, the liver is this, you know, the lung is this, but then the interactions between them, it's harder to see sometimes.
Yes, it's not that clear.
Yeah. So I think with like the beauty of Dr. Wang's his understanding is just making those connections a bit clearer, and then also see a direct connection with the patient's body, right? Like the actual physical human body. You can see how these channels actually do have that physiological function, because when there's pathology to that channel, it'll reflect in the channels, right? So then you actually see, oh yeah, like the lung and spleen do regulate dampness, right? Because the patient does have symptoms of dampness, and they also actually have changes on their hand tying lung and foot tying spleen channels. So it just makes all the theories more concrete, more real, right? It's not just that. Yeah.
Definitely.
So I think that's Dr. Wang's.
And makes the treatment more specific as well.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, it prevents you from doing too much too, right? Over treating the patient and just trying to make it more, leading to a more precise kind of diagnosis.
And that leads us to the next question, which is, what do you believe sets Dr. Wang Ju Yi approach to acupuncture apart from other schools or styles within traditional Chinese medicine?
So I would say, because of my studies with Dr. Wang, like I was the kind of student where I just put all of my attention into one teacher, right? So I'm not familiar with the other schools of thought. So I don't want to, I'm very bad at answering this question, but I would say that, like, I don't want to say one method is better than the other, but I find that like each student or practitioner of Chinese medicine should find a school of thought or an approach that suits their way of thinking, that suits their personality or their way of thinking. And for me, I think applied channel theory is the best one for me. Like, it's just because it's very comprehensive. I like the analytical aspect to it. And as I was mentioning earlier, just that process of trying to figuring out the patient's diagnosis. I think that is great about this. There's a lot of flexibility to the diagnosis. And you can, and having this very concrete information, right, through the palpation, like it keeps your diagnosis more objective, right, and clear. So there's that pragmatic aspect too to Dr. Wang's approach, which I really enjoy. And like prevent you from being lost in like this theoretical like web of like too many concepts, right? Getting lost in the theory, right? So I think that's what I enjoy about Dr. Wang's system. Let me just think one more thing. And then so I think that's one beautiful thing about Dr. Wang's approach is helping you to achieve a clear diagnosis. And like you were mentioning earlier, this kind of precision, right? Like how do we achieve like a more precise approach where, you know, like Dr. Wang always emphasized that when we treat patients, we should be, he says, when we select points, we should be less points, but more precise, right? Jīng, like, so like you choose less points to achieve like the most optimal results, right? So I kind of like his approach because it prevents you from being too mechanical in your approach, or too like, recipe style, cookbook style approach, where like a patient comes with a headache, then we use these 5 points or 10 points and right? Or like, for me, that would be very boring after a long period of time if like for every patient you use the same approach, right? Like, I have witnessed, I don't want to criticize people, but like I see people in other certain hospitals where like the patient comes with back pain, that's very common, and they use the same points on every patient. And it'll have effect. The patient will feel better, but I think the question is like, do you really have to use all those points, right? Like, is it necessary, right? Like, because I know when you do palpation and you do proper symptom pattern differentiation, that's my daughter, you can usually get like, you don't have to use that as many points, right? And I think there's something stimulating about trying to figure out what is the actual deeper pathology, right? And like, how do we regulate that?
And Chinese medicine can do so much better.
Yeah.
Throwing a few needles and yes.
So I think it's just like for the betterment of your own understanding of this medicine, I think this approach is great. I really don't know as much about the other approaches, but I think just like the idea, but I do know like it's very easy to get lost in the theory. And then I think we have to just try to not to like, so I think this approach keeps you more grounded and prevents you from being lost in the theory, right? Because it provides that very objective information. Yeah, I think just like, just clear diagnosis, less points, you know, and just because it gives, like I was saying, it gives you that flexibility. You have a better understand, like if the treatment's working, you know why it's working, right? Because you use less points, you're less channels, you have a better idea of what was working. If it's not working, then you also know it too, right? Because you're like,
I always think about that. Yes.
And you have a better idea to like modify your, right? So I think there's a lot more flexibility to the approach, which I enjoy.
Excellent. Okay. And my last question, how do you continue Dr. Wang's legacy in your own practice and teaching? And also if you, I don't know if you're teaching soon somewhere, but also if you want to mention that for people watching us.
Right. So yeah, I think one thing when I studied with Dr. Wang, there was in 2013, he had this ceremony for what he called like the Ren. So people he said were graduates of his system, and they were acknowledged as, you know, his official instructors, and that included, you know, like Jason, Lisa, Yifin, Lee, and myself. And then and in 2015 he had this other ceremony, like, because I did never get involved with these things, but then this one of the Chinese was like, oh, there's gonna be this thing for this thing called 入室弟子, and then that means like that, like, I think you could call it like an indoor apprentice kind of idea. I didn't know what that meant. I was like, okay, sure, but I don't know what that means, you know. And like, so I kept asking Dr. over a number of years, like, what does that mean? Like, what's the difference between earlier that thing that happened in 2013 and this 2015 thing? And he told me, he was like, he'd sit back, he'd like, how do I explain this? Because, you know, it's a very cultural thing too. I was like, I don't know what that. So then I remember him saying like, the 2013 things means that you have graduated. But this, now that you're a 入室弟子, that means that you're going to be a student for life. And then what I didn't realize was that after he passed away, I'm still his student for life, you know. And like what you're saying is this responsibility, right, to continue to pass on his teachings. And I find that like the best way to honor his legacy or to do that properly was like, from teaching students and teaching it from his way, right? Like, how did he approach it? Because like, I think like it's very, for a lot of us, we will develop or evolve his system, right? And that's natural for any system, right? But I find that like Dr. Wang, he did express his wishes to me where that like if it is taught, right, this system, to teach it according to his way of teaching. So I think that's what he really hammered home to me, and especially his last year or two of his life. Like he kept on mentioning that to me. So that's what I've tried to do. So even though, so what I try to do is, and what I realized is that because Dr. Wang was very, like everything he did, everything he taught was based on something that he had tested out clinically. Mm-hmm. So he knew for certain that this method worked because he had tested on thousands and thousands of patients. And yes. He had tested trial and error over decades, right? So I think he already went through that process of, like trial and error, so that we know that his final conclusion, was accurate, very accurate, right? Even though he continued to evolve his understanding. So what I try to do is just try to pass on what I learned from him, from like the foundational knowledge I learned from him. Because what I hope is that I'm going to pass on everything I know about Dr. Wang, what he taught us, to you guys, with the hope that someone in that pool of students will eventually be like the next Dr. Wang, who will like evolve it or develop it in a certain way. Be at make a planetary this system rate like even higher, status, or not status, but higher, higher skill level, right? Like it just improve its overall like results or understanding or deeper understanding of the system, right? So I'm hoping that within these group of students that I teach, that eventually, hopefully someone will get to that, surpass, Dr. Wang's understanding. So, but I think to do that, I have to make sure that they're learning like the foundational parts of the system accurately, right? So one is through teaching, right? So when we do like whether it's the online teaching or, in-person classes, I really try to pass on what Dr. Wang taught to me, right? So that's just like more like a direct transmission, right, of his knowledge. I don't want to add, because I know sometimes if we add too much of our own thinking into it, then it can lead to people to go astray, right? And then that can lead to misinterpretations. So that's what I try to avoid. Not to say it's wrong to have your own interpretations of how a system should be taught, but just out of respect and to honor Dr. Wang's method, I just try to focus on what he taught. But I think like when you learn the foundational methods properly, systematically, then I think you can really learn a lot and gain a lot from that, right? So that's number one. Number two is that the more I practice Dr. Wang's approach, and then really stick to what he did, then I'm always reminded that, I always remind myself, like every day you're like, oh, Dr. Wang was right. That's the one thing. I have like an idea like, I think I could, maybe it's this. And then you go back to like how Dr. Wang did things. Like, oh no, he was right. Because like he really, tested things out over, so many patients.
So many people, yes.
So it can avoid you from walking, like, going astray, like walking, like getting confused by like, random, like, like other things, like kind of distract you from following like a better approach, right? So that's one thing. And then I think, so the other thing I think by having students or when practicing, that to really try to stick to Dr. Wang's approach as much as I can clinically, right? Because then in order to be a good teacher of this, or just really to prove to myself that this system works, I really try to stick to his principles, right? His process. And I think that when I do that more, like, then I usually gain a lot from that, right? Because then you're like, oh yeah, you just use these 3 points or 4 points and you got really good results. And so I think that's what I try to do to honor his legacy. And like, I think because he had like in the latter year, like in 2017, he passed away in 2017. One thing that, like, before he passed away, one thing that he had expressed to me was the fear that his system would be lost over time, like all of his life's work would be lost over time. And I remember telling him and reassuring him that don't worry, Dr. Wang, more and more people are studying this and want to learn this, so don't worry, there will be more people studying this. So I think that's like this kind of, I have to keep up my promise to him, that, and it's not just me, there are a lot of other students of Dr. Wang who are to teach this too. So I do feel confident that his system is continuing to be taught and passed on to future generations. Like, that's why, you are a very good student of this.
That's what we hear. Yes.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, it's just like, yeah, big responsibility. Like, one thing I never thought I was going to was going to happen, right? You know, I first studied Chinese medicine. My main goal is just to treat myself. You know, I didn't think I could treat other people or that I would be teaching other people.
Yeah, same here. Yes. Great. That was amazing.
All your questions properly.
All my questions. Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time now. But you know, I'm always very grateful to you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for doing this. I'm sure people will benefit, students, and I think it was really important to, yeah, for them to know you, know this approach, this style, this understanding, and spread the word a little bit more.
Okay, thanks,
According
Damián.
to following Dr. Wang's, you know, the side.
Right. If you have any other questions you want to add later, we can rearrange another time too if you want.
Definitely, definitely. Excellent. Thank you so much, John.
Okay, thanks, Damián.
Okay.